Yeah, hello everyone, and welcome to today's workshop training. It's your host Felix, and today we are going to be talking about Azure Blob service. So, currently we are in our work environment now, which is our Azure environment, but we're going to go through a bit of documentation to have an idea of what we want to do today, then proceed to use the Azure portal to practicalize what we have learned. So, let's see the documentation we have here today, guys. It's titled Introduction to Azure Blob Storage. So, Blob Storage here basically is Microsoft's storage solution for large unstructured data. So, structured data here could be images, it could be files, could be videos, could be music files, and so on and so forth, right? So, basically, what the Blob Storage does for you is that it allows you to store massive unstructured data. And this sort of data now can be, saved to browsers directly. You could share the URL or the links to the containers in which you've created for this data to other people to access the data. There are just a whole lot of functions for this Azure Blob Storage. So let us go through this document and see what it says. It says here, Azure Blob Storage is Microsoft's object storage solution for the cloud. Blob storage is optimized for storing massive amounts of unstructured data. Unstructured data is data that doesn't adhere to a particular data model or definition, such as text or binary data. About blob storage, blob storage is designed for saving images or documents directly to a browser. I'd mentioned that earlier. It can be used for storing files for distributed access, streaming video and audio. Some of your streaming solutions like YouTube, Spotify, and the rest, they use this sort of storage to store data for their users to access from wherever they are. It can also be used to write log files. The blob storage is also designed for storing data for backup and restore, disaster recovery, and archiving, meaning that it's a very good solution in case you have a need to store backup or data long term. It can also be used for storing data analysis via an on-premises or Azure hosted service. Users or client applications can access objects in storage via HTTP or HTTPS from anywhere in the world. Objects in blob storage can objects in blob storage are accessible via the Azure Storage REST API, Azure PowerShell, and Azure CLI, which is like the client command line interface. I mean, or an Azure Storage Client Library. So basically, these are like the different ways in which you can use in accessing an Azure Blob storage service. Clients can also securely connect to blob storage by using SSH file transfer, which is secure shell hashing file transfer protocol SFTP, and mount blob storage containers by using the network file system NFS 3.0 protocol. So basically, this is like a brief of what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to take us to somewhere else for us to know what we are going to be doing. So let's come here. It says blob storage blob storage resources. Blob storage offers three types of resources, which is a storage account, a container in the storage account, and a blob in a container. So what this means is that for you to have a container that holds your blob, means you have to have a storage account first. So a storage account houses a container, and a container houses your blobs. Blobs cannot be uploaded independently into a storage account without a container, and containers cannot be created on Azure without you having to create a storage account first. So this diagram here explains what I've just said so far. So you have an account here named Sally, and this account also has containers named pictures and movies. And we can also see that under pictures here we have image 001 JPG and JPG. We also have image 002 JPG. In other movies we have MOV1.avi. So basically that's like the workflow. A storage account, a container, then your blobs in the container. So let's come down here. Storage accounts provide a unique namespace in Azure for your data. Every object that you store in Azure has an address that includes a unique account name. So whatever address you generate from your storage account, it means the account name you created for your storage account will be included in that name. The combination of the account name and the blob storage endpoint forms the best address for the object in the storage account. We are going to see all of this on the Azure portal. For example, if your storage account is named my storage, then the default endpoint for blob storage is, you can see it here, my storage account.blob.co.windows. So like that's like the first portion here. The first portion here is the name of your storage account, then followed by the other credentials I'll be using accessing a particular blob, which would include the container itself and the blob in the container. The following table describes different types of storage accounts that are supported for blob storage. So we have the general purpose V2, and the performance tier here is standard. Standard storage account type for blobs, file shares, queues, and tables. Recommended for scenarios using blob storage or one of the other Azure storage services. So this one here, the general purpose V2 account here encapsulates every kind of blob you might need. So it's being listed here. So for blobs, for file shares, for queues, and for tables, and it's generally a cheaper type of storage account, unlike the blob, which the performance share is premium, and also the page blob, which the performance share is also premium. And the reason why it's cheaper is because it uses HHD sorry, to store data, while the premium and while the blob here, which is premium, and the page blob here, which is also premium, uses SSD to store data. So under the blob here, we can see that premium storage account type for blobs and append blobs recommended for scenarios with high transaction rates or that use smaller objects or require consistently low storage latency. So we can say that this one is specifically meant for blog blobs, right? It's not like the first one here, which is like more like a general purpose account that can house files, queues, tables, and the rest blobs. So the next one here is page blobs, premium storage account for page blobs only. And don't worry, we're going to go through all of these as the series continues. So let's just jump over to see what it says about containers. A container organizes a set of blobs similar to a directory in a file system. Storage accounts can include an unlimited number of containers, and a container can store an unlimited number of blobs. It is highly scalable to store as much data, as much blobs as you want to. The container name must be a valid DNS name, as it forms part of the unique URI, Uniform Resource Identifier, used to address the container or its blobs. Follow these rules when naming a container. Container names can be between 3 and 63 characters long, meaning that you can exceed this. You can't also go below 3. Container names must start with a letter or number and can contain only lower case letters, numbers, and the dash character, meaning that you can't use capital letters to name your container. The third thing here is that two or more consecutive dash characters aren't permitted in container names. That you can have two dash characters in your container name, which you're also going to see. We're definitely going to try all of these out. Then for blobs here, Azure Storage supports three types of blobs. Blob blobs. Blob blobs store text and binary data. Blob blobs are made up of blocks of data that can be managed individually. Blob blobs can store up to about 190 terabytes of data. You can also see here, append blobs are made up of blocks like block blobs, but are optimized for append operations. Append operations are ideal for scenarios such as logging data from virtual machines. So append blob says it's like a kind of blob that stores continuous data, like the data doesn't end. So it keeps, let's say a virtual machine keeps writing logs of data to an append blob, meaning that it's continuous, it doesn't end, so it continues that way. So page blobs store random access files up to 8 terabytes in size. Page blobs store virtual machine drive VHD files and save as disks for Azure virtual machines. For more information, you can see here. So, guys, with this knowledge here, we are going to quickly move over to Azure to see what we can do on Azure. So, we're currently here in our Azure environment, and we have storage account here, and it's here because it's one of my frequently used service. You can also find it on the pen here, right? Which is it's here, you can see it here. But if you're new to the Azure environment, a place that would always help you find resources whenever you want or need them is this search icon here. So we're just going to search for storage account. So you can see your storage account. We're just going to click here to see what we can do with this. So we already have a couple of storage accounts here. Yeah, but we're going to create a new one. So let's create a new storage account. And have it in mind what we were told. So here is the basic section which we are going to complete, then move over to another section. So if you work in an environment that has multiple subscriptions, this is where you choose the subscription in which you want to create your storage account under. But my current tenant has just one subscription, so we'll just leave it here. Then it's important to know that on Azure, you can't create any resource without provisioning that resource to a resource group. So there's already mine here called Felix RG, but let's just create a new one and house this storage account there. Let's call this LinkedIn demo, LinkedIn, LinkedIn RG. I'm gonna put a dash here. So we've created this. So let's call our storage account. Remember, you can't use capital letters to name your storage account, right? So if I try using capital letters now, I'm just going to flag it with this error. Name must be, let me do this. So you can see the field can only contain lowercase letters and numbers. Name must be between 3 and 24 characters. So let's do this. Okay, let's call the storage account. Let's call this, let's just call this LinkedIn demo. Oh, sorry, I added a dash. A dash can only be used for containers, not storage account. So I'm just going to leave this here. And here, depending on the region where you want to provision your storage account to, you can come here to choose your region. And when choosing a region, it's always important you have certain things in mind. Things like what the policy for your organization is, because I know certain organizations have different policies in regards to how they provision their resources. So you need to have that in mind. Then also, you also need to put it in mind, you also need to put your customers in mind or your users in mind. Where would they be accessing or using these resources from? So you need to choose a region that is closer to them so they can easily reach the server without having downtime. Remember, one of the most important advantages of the cloud is high availability. So it's important to choose a region that supports this for your organization. So I'll go for East US. Then it's not really important. I mean, you can always come here to choose what the primary service for this storage account is. But I know mine is general purpose, so I'm not going to necessarily choose anyone here. So I'll just continue. So here we can see here we had spoken about general purpose accounts, which we know that it can store literally any kind of blob from files to blobs to blobs and so on and so forth. But we also know that if you choose premium here, premium would have to choose the kind of blobs in which you want to use it for. Are we using it for file shares? Are we using it for blobs? Are we using it for page blobs? But we want something that would encapsulate all of them without necessarily defining it to just a particular kind of blob. So the redundancy option here is also another very important part of creating a resource on Azure or on the cloud anywhere. And this is because Redundancy here literally states or showcases how available or highly available your resource is going to be whenever there is a downtime or any issue that might interfere with users being able to access your resource. So if we are going with locally redundant storage, what that means is that it's going to replicate our data three times in the same data center, meaning that it gives us basic protection against server rack and drive failures, but it can't protect us against data center failures. That's like the whole data center. If something happens to the whole data center, it means we wouldn't have access to our resources because the whole data center is being affected and we had used locally redundant storage. Geo-redundant storage, on the other hand, is a highly available redundancy option. And what this means is that your data is not just replicated in the primary zone three times in a particular data center, but it is also replicated in another geographical zone entirely. So what that means is that you have three copies of your data in one region, and you also have three copies of your data in another region in the same data center, meaning that it doesn't only protect you against data center failure, protects you against region-wide failure. Because if there's an issue with a particular region, you can always fail over to the region pair of this solution. Zone redundant, zone redundant here protects us against data center level failures, and that is because it replicates our data three times in three different data centers in the same region. And what that means is that if a data center fails, you can easily fail over to other data centers in the same region, but you're not protected against region-wide failure like we have here in GRS. And Joe zone here simply it's a combination of LRS, ZRS, and GRS. So what that means is that your data is replicated in two different regions, and in the primary region, it uses ZRS to replicate your data three times in three different data centers, and it uses LRS in the secondary region to replicate your data three times in the same data center. And and here we know that this is the most highly available scenario, right? But since this is just a demo, we don't really need all of this. So we are going to go with our locally redundant storage to create this account. So let's go to next and see what happens. So the advanced option here, there are a couple of things I want us to choose, but I'm just going to talk about the blob storage access tier. And for these other services, we are going to talk about them in subsequent trainings because we will need them to actually provision resources. So the access tier here talks about what access level you want your data to be stored in. So hot tier is optimized for frequently accessed data and everyday usage scenarios, meaning that if it's a kind of data in which you use on a daily basis, it means that hot is the best option for you. So hot has a very hot is expensive in terms of storing your data, but relatively cheap in terms of accessing the data. So the next one here is cold, is optimized for even frequently accessed data and backup scenarios. So like data you don't use up to a period of 30 days, you can put it here in this cool access tier. And code here is for data that is usually not accessed within a period of 90 days. So you can bring it here. So what you need to have in mind is how frequently do I need to access my data? That's really just what the access tier here does. So if it's something you need to access frequently within a period of 30 days or also like everyday usage, then you know that hot tier is your best option. Then cool here is best if data has to be accessed maybe after every 30 days or so. Then code 90 days. Then there's another access tier which is usually not included while creating a storage account. But after creation, you can always choose to move your storage account, your containers and so on to that storage account tier. It is called archive. So archive is for data that is infrequently accessed up to a period of 180 days. So guys, I think that explains everything we want to do here. So I'm just going to leave this here in hot, then we are going to proceed. So the next thing here we need to have in mind is networking. Networking is a very important component of storage account, and that is because it is networking that gives users access to our storage account. So what one thing you need to have in mind is security. Who do I want to access my storage account? Who am I giving the right and privileges to access the storage account? Because your storage account gives people access to your blobs and data. And depending on who has your information or who has access to your storage account, it could be in the hands of bad actors who might use this for bad purposes. But for the purpose of this training, we're just going to leave it here in public access from all networks. You can also leave it here in access from selected virtual networks and IP addresses, meaning that you can really specify it or limit it to a particular virtual network or IP address, meaning that data can only be accessed from that virtual network or public IP. You can also disable public access entirely and add an endpoint for people for whoever has the right and privilege to access privately. But let's leave it here. The next thing here we need to do is data protection, right? So for most of these here, I wouldn't bother explaining them, and that is because I have a list of other workshops in which we are going to do, and we're going to need the services, meaning that I would have to come back to explain them. But to limit the time on this video, we'll just leave them for now. So we can see here enable soft delete for blobs. What soft delete basically means is that if something is deleted, if a blob is deleted in my storage account, it means that the blob or the account, the storage account should still retain that blob for a period of 7 days. And within that 7 days, I can always go back to restore the deleted blob. And this is useful in scenarios where accidental deletion might occur, meaning that I didn't really plan on deleting the data, but I did. So within that period, I can always go back to restore my data. So I can increase this to maybe 30 days if that's what the policy is in your organization or whatever you want. But I'll just leave it at 7 because that's the default. So the same thing here for containers, the same thing here for file shares. Then versioning, a very important thing. We'll come back to this later. Block change feed, very important also. We'll come back to this later. Access control, very important. We'll come back to this later. So the next thing here we're going to look at is encryption. Well, basically, we're not going to do anything with encryption here because we've not really dealt. Encryption is a whole different topic on its own. So we're just going to leave it here in its default state. So the next thing is tags. Tags helps you identify your resource and also to organize your resources in a system where in a particular system as prescribed by your organization or whoever the or whatever the governance structure says in your organization, right? But we have no tags, so we won't bother to create a tag. So the next thing here we're going to do is to review and create. So let's see if this passes the review set so we can create our storage account. So validation is still in progress. So we can now see that we are okay. So let's create. And remember, all of this can also be done using PowerShell, Bash, and other REST interfaces. Or I just using this GUI because we are just beginning, so it's simpler to use this to learn. So guys, we can see that deployment of our storage account is in progress. So let's wait for it to be completely deployed so we can now go ahead to create a container, then also add blobs to our container. So guys, let's go to resource and do this. So you can see that storage account here, since we are choosing GPV2, which is general purpose, it has literally every kind of blob service available. We have here the blob service, we have the file service, we also have queue service, table service. But what we're working on today is the blob service. So Let's click here and proceed. So we want to create a container. Remember, while creating a container, you can't use capital letters. It shouldn't be lower than 3 characters or above 63 characters. So this is what I mean, right? So you can see here it's not going to go, right? Because it's lower, we need to use lowercase. Let's make this, right? We also have the option of adding two dash, I'm sorry, one dash, but not two dashes. But this one dash has to be accompanied by something else. It shouldn't just end that way. So you can see it here. So let's just call this LinkedIn container. I'm naming everything LinkedIn today. LinkedIn container one, because I'm going to create two. So if you click on advanced, we can see a couple of other things there. But this will be a lesson for another day. So let's create this container. I'm also going to create another container again. Let's call this LinkedIn container 2. Remember, you can also use numbers to name your storage account. Sorry, both your storage account and your containers. So we have two storage accounts here now. So I'm going to upload just a single blob in one of these containers, and also upload multiple blobs in another container, and shows how to access this container from a different place entirely other than our environment here. So let's add something to our container. We're just going to click here on upload, browse files. Let me add this. This is a picture of me. I'm going to click on upload. That has been uploaded. Right. So supposing I've saved this blob now to my container now called LinkedIn container one, right? And I want to give someone a link or an access to this storage account without necessarily giving them my account container keys or anything, or give them so much privilege to my container or Azure storage account. I can easily just generate what is called a SAS token, or sorry, SAS URI. SAS here means shared access signature. I'm going to be covering this in a whole different video entirely and explain it comprehensively. So SAS here generates a link for you to for one to access a blob in a container from anywhere, depending on the policies you apply to the SAS. So let's see. We're going to click on generate SAS. So I'm going to be taking into account keynote user delegation key. So you can see here, signing key. It has everything here we need. Doesn't have any stored access policy. But let's see the permissions. Permissions here means permission here is just simply to read this blob. You can always add other permissions here depending on what we want the individual to do. Alright, well, let's just leave it on read. Then another thing we can see here is that you can also make it time based, meaning that you can give someone access to your blog or even a container for a particular period of time. For you, we can see that the expiry for this blob is going to be by 1 minute past 11 p.m. West Central African time, and the start time here is 1 minute past 3 p.m. West Central African time, which is actually my current time now at the moment. And another thing we can also see here is that we can specify the IP address in which we want this blob to be accessed from, right? But we are not going to do that because it's just a demo test. So let's generate our SAS and see what we can do with this. So this is the token and this is the URL. The only thing we need here now is just the URL. So let's take this. I'm going to open an incognito tab and launch this on the browser and see what it shows us. So this is what I uploaded to that container. A picture of my LinkedIn background picture, Felix Williams, Cloud Infrastructure Consultant. That's what I did so far. So meaning that I can send this link to anyone to access this. Could have been any other kind of file, and the person will be able to download the file or do whatever he wants to do with the file, depending on the permissions and privileges I've added to the URI I generated to send to the person. So let's go back to our environment. So I've done this here. Now let's go back to the container itself. So do you remember we have another container? So I'm going to upload a bulk. I'm going to upload bulk blobs here and see if you're still going to be able to access the blobs using the URI. So let's say I'm uploading all of these, right? So let's say I have all of this. I'm putting all of this in that container. So I'm going to upload them. So I want I want the person I'm giving the access to be able to view every container in this, but to view every blob in this particular container called LinkedIn container 2. So let's generate a SAS for this. Remember, we have already gone through all of these, so we know what this means. So let's generate a SAS token, a URL. So we've done that. Let's even add one more permission to this. Generate, copy. Let's go back to our incognito tab. Let's paste this. So we can see that you can't access this container using the URI on a web browser, and it's simply because you can't actually use web browser to view a whole container, right? Unlike individual blobs, which you can use a browser to view them, you can't use web browsers to view the whole container itself. So what you're going to need in this case now is the Azure Storage Explorer, which I had already downloaded, and I'm going to show us how to use this. Another important thing we should have in mind is that if you are going to use Azure Storage Explorer to view a whole container, then we need to give the list permission, at least a list permission, so it can list the blobs in the container. Otherwise, if I should take this out and generate the URL and take this to my Azure Storage Explorer, right? And the thing is, you don't need to connect this to an account. You can with if you have an access, you can easily just attach a resource using this attach a resource option to view the container. So we are not viewing a storage account or service. We are viewing the blob container or directory, and we are using a shared access signature to do this. So let's see what we get from here. I'm going to put this here, and we can see the error. The SaaS has inadequate permissions. A service SaaS with at least list permission is required. And what that means is that without the list permission, the URL on this storage account explorer will not be able to list the blobs in that container. So we're going to take this out, right? And use the former URL we have generated, which has the list permission. So that's, let me take this out, right? So it was this one here. So we can see it's okay. So let's just click on next. So we can now connect to that storage container, and it's going to list everything in the storage container. So you can see here, it has everything I had uploaded. All right, so let's click on one and see what it shows us. So you can see, and so guys, this is a brief of what the Azure Blob Storage does for us. In subsequent videos, I'm going to be going more in depth on other Azure Storage service scenarios, particularly on blobs, then file shares and the other ones we had heard about earlier. So guys, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment on this video so it reaches newer audiences who also need materials like this. So cheers guys, see you in a subsequent workshop.